It started with a scream. Not a loud, panicked one, but the kind that gets stuck in your throat, half swallowed by disbelief. The kind that makes everyone around pause, glance up, and feel that slow, creeping chill that something isn't right. At Terminal C of the Atlanta airport, Senator John Kennedy stood frozen in front of a TSA checkpoint, his arms half raised, eyes locked on the man barking orders at him like he was some kind of criminal. "Take off the jacket," the agent snapped. "Slowly. Real slow, country boy." A few people chuckled nervously in line. Others looked away. But Kennedy didn't move. Not out of pride, not out of fear, but because for the first time in a very long time, a man used to commanding rooms, debates, and legislation was being reduced to a caricature in public, judged not by his record, but by the southern drawl in his voice and the age in his face. His jacket, by the way, had no metal, no wires, no suspicious bulges. Only a few papers and a worn leather wallet. The agent, Rick Darrow, wasn't new. He'd worked TSA for 5 years. Before that, he served in the Marines. And before that, he'd racked up 2 viral videos on YouTube berating travelers who dared to challenge his authority. He was proud of it. He liked order, control, and above all, submission. So when Kennedy politely asked, "Is there a problem, sir?" Rick didn't hear a question. He heard defiance. "You think just 'cause you're old and got a deep voice, you can skip protocol? What are you, some kind of senator?" The irony hung heavy in the air. Kennedy said nothing. He simply reached into his inner coat pocket, slow and careful, and pulled out a small leather case. He opened it and held it up, his official Senate ID, gleaming under the airport fluorescence. Rick leaned in, squinting at it, then laughed. Actually laughed. "Cute," he muttered. "Real cute." The crowd started shifting. A few passengers now had phones out, not recording yet, but holding them the way people do when they know they just might. One teenage girl whispered to her friend, "Isn't that someone important?" But Rick didn't care. To him, everyone was either compliant or a threat. And right now, Kennedy's calm, his unwillingness to get angry, felt like a challenge. "I said step out of line," Rick barked again, louder. "We're going to do a full body search. Back room." Kennedy's expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. A subtle shift, a silent calculation. And then he spoke, not in anger, not in defense, but with the gravity of a man who had stared down far worse things than airport theatrics. "This isn't the way," he said quietly. "You're making a mistake, one that's bigger than you realize." But Rick leaned closer, invading space that should have been sacred, and whispered, "I don't care who you are. Out here, you're just another guy in line." And that, right there, was the line that turned this moment from awkward to unforgettable. Because that's when a phone, held just to the side, lit up with a soft red dot. Recording. Someone had decided enough was enough. And if you're reading this now, if you're hearing this, you're probably wondering what happened next. Did Kennedy comply? Did Rick escalate? Did the crowd finally speak up? Well, before I tell you that, do me a favor. If you've ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly, if you've ever stood in silence when you should have spoken up, or better yet, if you believe dignity shouldn't depend on status or name tags, hit like and comment the number 9. Not for the algorithm, but to show the world you're watching. You're awake. You're one of us. Because what happens next is going to make your heart race, and maybe even restore a little faith. Rick Darrow's eyes twitched toward the red light of the phone recording from the corner. Just for a moment. Just long enough for something to shift in the air. He turned back to Kennedy with a sneer, trying to reassert dominance, but the edge in his voice had dulled ever so slightly. "I don't care who's filming," he muttered, his voice lower now, but not any less threatening. "You step out of this line, or I'll have you detained for obstruction." Kennedy stood still, his hands open, calm, unflinching. "And I respectfully ask again," he said slowly. "On what grounds?" Rick's jaw clenched. For a man like him, being questioned, especially by someone who wouldn't raise their voice or throw a fit, was infuriating. Kennedy wasn't yelling. He wasn't threatening lawsuits. He was just still, controlled. And that made Rick feel smaller than any insult could have. He turned to the watching crowd. "Everybody back!" he barked. "This doesn't concern you." But it did concern them. The old man with the calm eyes and quiet voice had become a mirror. Everyone there could imagine being in his shoes. A young father shuffled his daughter behind him. A woman in business attire stepped to the side, subtly angling her phone to get a better view. And the teenager from earlier? She was already live streaming. Rick reached for his radio. "Possible non-compliant traveler," he said into it, loud enough for others to hear. "Requesting backup." There was a beat of static, then silence. No immediate response. No cavalry. Kennedy's voice cut through the moment like a quiet breeze before a storm. "You've called for backup against an unarmed man holding his ID," he said, his tone measured but firm. "That's going to play real well in the morning news cycle," Rick snapped. "You think you're safe because of who you are? I've dealt with big shots before. You're nothing but a headline waiting to happen." He took a step forward and raised his hand. Not to hit, not yet, but in a motion that looked too close to danger. That's when a second voice broke through the noise. "Rick," it said, calm, clear, and sharp as glass. The crowd turned. So did the cameras. A woman in her 40s, crisp uniform, TSA badge shining, approached with deliberate steps. She wore no makeup, no expression, and no hesitation. "What are you doing?" she asked, without raising her voice. Rick's face froze. "Director Barrett?" he said, stunned. He hadn't seen her arrive. He hadn't expected her here. And he definitely hadn't expected her to be standing behind him, watching the whole thing. "This passenger was being—" he started. "No," she interrupted. "This passenger was calm, respectful, and compliant. I've been watching for 4 minutes. That's all it took to see you were out of line." Rick opened his mouth, but nothing came out. A dozen phones were raised now. The passengers weren't just witnesses, they were evidence. Director Barrett turned to Kennedy and gave a nod. "Senator," she said, her tone immediately shifting to professional courtesy. "On behalf of the agency, I apologize for this incident. You are, of course, free to continue your travel." Kennedy didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply nodded back. "I'm not concerned for me," he said, looking around at the crowd. "But for the people who don't wear this badge," he pointed gently at his Senate ID, "and still get treated worse." Rick turned to her, desperation creeping into his voice. "I didn't know it was him," he said. "He wasn't acting like a senator." Barrett's expression turned to ice. "You shouldn't treat people based on how they act. You treat them based on how you're trained. And you failed. Publicly." The silence that followed was deafening. Rick's shoulders slumped. His mouth moved, searching for excuses, but all that came out was breath. Shaky, heavy breath. Barrett turned to the officers behind her. "Escort him out, and secure the footage, all of it." As Rick was led away through the crowd, no one cheered, no one clapped, but dozens of eyes followed him. Quiet, judging, unblinking. A fall from grace doesn't always happen with noise. Sometimes it happens in the hush between authority and consequence. Kennedy turned to the teenager still recording and gave her a small nod. "Keep that safe," he said. "The world needs to see more of the truth, not less." She nodded silently, as if understanding the weight of what she held. And as the line slowly resumed and TSA officers returned to their posts, something lingered in the air. Not just the echo of confrontation, but a feeling that something bigger had just shifted. That for once, accountability had arrived. Right on time. The terminal slowly resumed its rhythm, but the tension didn't vanish. It simply shifted. People moved, but their glances lingered on where Rick had stood, where he had tried to assert power and failed. For Senator Kennedy, the moment wasn't over. Not really. As he picked up his bag and passed through the checkpoint under the direct supervision of Director Barrett, he couldn't help but wonder how many others had walked that same path and never had a camera, never had a badge, never had a crowd. "Are you sure you're okay, Senator?" Barrett asked, as she guided him through the gate area, her voice calm but taut with concern. Kennedy gave a soft nod. "I've had worse days, but I'm not the one who worries me." He looked over his shoulder at the young mother holding her daughter, the teenager still holding her phone tight, the businessman with tense shoulders. It's the people who go through that every day and don't have a title to shield them. Barrett sighed, her professionalism cracking just slightly. "We're supposed to be better than this," she said. "But men like Rick." "Our symptoms?" Kennedy finished. "Not the disease." They walked in silence for a moment until a new voice interrupted them, a voice that didn't come from any of the crowd, but from an overhead speaker. "Attention passengers. Due to a security review, several flights may be delayed. Please check monitors for updates." Kennedy's flight wasn't for another hour, but he wasn't watching the screen. He was watching the ripples, the phones still recording, the whispers, the nods. Then another twist. From the far end of the terminal, a man in a gray suit came jogging toward them, waving a press badge. "Senator Kennedy, Jason Moore, Channel 6. Can I get a comment about what just happened at security?" Before Kennedy could reply, two more reporters appeared from nowhere, one already live streaming. "Senator, are you going to file a complaint? Did you feel racially profiled? Was this age discrimination?" The questions came rapid fire, chaotic, and dangerously misdirected. Kennedy held up a hand, not with authority, but with clarity. "Let me say this once. This is not about me. I'm not the story here. What happened at that checkpoint is happening to people every day who don't have anyone listening. Today you're listening. So let's talk about that." The reporters fell quiet. Even the cameraman lowered his rig slightly, as if something in Kennedy's tone reminded him this wasn't a moment to exploit, but one to understand. Director Barrett glanced at him, her eyes softening. "Would you be willing to speak to the TSA staff in the conference room?" she asked. "Some of them saw parts of what happened. Some are rattled." Kennedy looked at his watch. He had 43 minutes before boarding. "Lead the way." Inside the staff conference room, the energy was thick with tension. Some agents looked guilty, others defensive, a few just confused. But when Kennedy entered, silence swept the room. No podium, no microphone. Just the weight of his presence and the echo of what had happened less than an hour before. He didn't start with anger. He didn't accuse. He told a story. "I was raised to believe that trust is earned, and that people in uniform, whether they're soldiers or officers or security staff, hold more than just authority. They hold responsibility." He looked around the room. You can't control what badge you wear, but you can control how you wear it. What Rick did today wasn't just unprofessional. It was a betrayal. Not just to me. To you. Every one of you. A young agent, barely in his 20s, spoke up. "Sir, I've only been here 3 months. I didn't know what to do. I froze." Kennedy turned to him. "Then learn from this. Don't freeze again. Don't look away when it's easier to stay silent. The people out there," he pointed toward the terminal, "they need you to be better than that." Barrett stood off to the side, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. But when Kennedy turned to leave, she stepped forward. "Senator," she said quietly, "we'll be launching an internal audit, effective immediately." He nodded once. "That's a start. But don't just look for other Ricks. Look for the people who stayed quiet and ask why." As Kennedy exited the room, the hallway felt different. Not quieter, but heavier. Like the walls themselves had absorbed something. Responsibility, maybe. Or truth. He passed by Sarah, the teenage girl with the phone, now surrounded by airport staff asking if she'd be willing to share the footage. She caught his eye and smiled. "I saved it in 3 places," she said proudly. "They can't make it disappear." Kennedy smiled back, the corner of his mouth lifting with something like hope. "Good. Because what we saw today, that needs to be seen. By everyone." As he walked back toward his gate, the PA system crackled again overhead. But this time, the announcement wasn't about delays. It was about security protocol changes, effective immediately. And for the first time in a long while, Kennedy felt like maybe, just maybe, the system had heard him. Or, more accurately, had seen him. Senator Kennedy sat quietly by Gate 47, a cup of black coffee cooling in his hand, untouched. The world around him buzzed with the usual airport sounds, boarding announcements, wheels rolling over tile, a baby crying somewhere in the distance. But none of it seemed to penetrate the stillness that surrounded him. People were watching now, not out of curiosity, but out of a newfound recognition. Not because of who he was, but because of what had just happened. And yet, for all the attention, Kennedy remained inward, reflective. Something had cracked open inside him, something that had less to do with being humiliated, and more to do with the system he'd trusted showing its worst face without shame. He replayed the scene in his head, not to relive the embarrassment, but to study it. The words Rick used, the way his voice changed when he thought no one important was watching, the look in his eyes when the power shifted, when Director Barrett called him out. That look stayed with Kennedy more than anything. The moment Rick realized he wasn't invincible. That no uniform, no history, no ego could protect him from the truth anymore. A soft ping from his phone broke the silence. It was a text from one of his aides in Washington. The videos everywhere, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, trending under #CheckpointKennedy. He sighed, both annoyed and grateful. The internet had done what institutions sometimes couldn't. It had forced people to look. A shadow passed in front of him. He looked up to see Sarah again, the teenage girl who had recorded everything. She held her phone in one hand, a nervous smile on her face. "I didn't mean to bother you," she said, "but they want me on the news, like actual TV. I've never done anything like this before." Kennedy gestured to the seat beside him. "Sit." She did. "You didn't do this for attention, did you?" he asked gently. "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "I just saw something wrong and I thought, if I don't film this, who will believe it happened?" He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "That's exactly the kind of question that changes the world." She blushed slightly, unsure how to respond. A moment later, a well-dressed man in his 50s approached. His badge read, Delta Executive Services. He knelt slightly, as if speaking to a head of state, not a weary man in a wrinkled blazer. "Senator Kennedy, sir, your flight has been upgraded and pre-cleared for priority boarding. On behalf of the airline, we'd like to extend our apologies and gratitude." Kennedy blinked. "Gratitude?" The man smiled, hesitant. "There are conversations happening, real ones, across departments, about how our staff engages with security protocol, about profiling, about respect." Kennedy simply nodded. Then don't apologize to me. Just follow through. As the executive walked away, Sarah looked at Kennedy and whispered, "Do you think this really changes anything?" He paused before answering. "I think moments like this are what you make of them. They can die out in 24 hours, or they can become something that forces people to confront what they've been ignoring." He turned to her. "But only if people like you keep asking that question. Keep showing up." Just then, his name was called over the intercom. "Final boarding call for Senator John Kennedy, Flight 2180 to D.C. He stood, shouldered his bag, then turned back to Sarah. "You saved my dignity with that video," he said. "But more importantly, you protected everyone who couldn't do what I could, who might have been silenced, ignored, or worse." She bit her lip, overwhelmed, then reached into her pocket. "Here," she said, handing him a small USB drive. "It's the full video, in case the internet tries to bury it later." He took it with a quiet nod, his fingers closing around it like it was something sacred. "You did good, kid," he said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She smiled, tears brimming just slightly, and watched as he turned and walked toward the gate. As Kennedy stepped onto the jet bridge, he felt the weight of more than just his carry-on. He carried the story now. Not just his, but Sarah's and everyone else's who had ever been stopped, humiliated, dismissed for daring to exist in spaces where power goes unchecked. He took his seat in first class, not with entitlement, but with purpose. A few passengers nodded at him quietly. One offered a thumbs up. A flight attendant bent slightly and whispered, "Thank you for how you handled that." He looked out the window as the plane began to taxi. The airport shrank slowly in the distance, but what happened there wasn't staying behind. It was coming with him, into the Capitol, into policy rooms, into the hearts of people who now saw just how easily justice could unravel, and how urgently it needed to be stitched back together. And somewhere back in the terminal, a teenage girl opened her phone, hit upload, and set the truth free. By the time Flight 2180 touched down in Washington, D.C., Senator John Kennedy had already received over 100 messages, some from colleagues, others from complete strangers. A few were short bursts of outrage. Most were stories, quiet, personal, painful. People who had experienced the same thing he had, but without the camera, without the badge, without the ending that let them walk away with dignity intact. As the wheels screeched against the tarmac, Kennedy realized this wasn't just a moment. It was a reckoning. Outside the terminal, a black SUV waited for him. Not unusual. What was unusual was the driver, one of his most senior staff members, Amanda Price, usually too busy wrangling schedules and policy briefings to be driving at all. "You're trending harder than the Super Bowl," she said as he climbed into the back seat. "They're calling it the checkpoint collapse." He gave her a side glance. "Catchy," he muttered. "Disturbing, but catchy." As they drove toward the Capitol, Amanda pulled out a thick folder. "This is just from the last 6 hours. Emails, statements, inquiries. TSA is spinning like a washing machine. Congress members from both sides are issuing support. Civil rights groups want meetings." She paused. "And there's something else. A petition circulating. Over 4 million signatures. People want mandatory federal oversight of all TSA checkpoints." Kennedy took the folder, flipping through the pages slowly. "They're not wrong." She hesitated. "Do you want to speak at the press conference tomorrow, or keep it quiet?" Kennedy looked out the window. "If I stay quiet, I become part of the silence that let this happen in the first place." He turned back. "We talk, but not about me. We talk about what this means for everyone else." The next morning, the press conference hall was packed. Reporters elbowed for space. Cameramen adjusted focus. But when Kennedy stepped to the podium, everything stilled. He didn't begin with outrage. He didn't perform. He told the story, plainly, just as it happened. And then he said something that made the room lean in. I wasn't treated that way because they didn't know who I was. I was treated that way because they didn't care who I was. And that should scare everyone in this country. Because if power can turn that fast on someone with a title, imagine what it does to the millions of Americans with no platform, no followers, no spotlight. Murmurs rippled across the room. He continued, voice unwavering. This isn't about embarrassment. This is about accountability. It's about dignity. It's about the kind of country we become when fear replaces respect, when judgment replaces procedure. And I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for reform. He announced a proposal, the Airport Conduct and Oversight Act, a bill to require independent accountability officers at major security hubs, establish passenger rights standards, and implement anonymous reporting systems for TSA abuse. But it wasn't the bill that set the room on fire. It was what he said next. There was a young woman named Sarah. She stood up when no one else did. Not with a weapon, not with a title, with a phone, with a spine, with a sense of right and wrong. And that courage changed everything. He paused, then looked directly into the camera lens. If you're watching this and you think your voice doesn't matter, ask Rick Darrow if Sarah's voice mattered. Ask the TSA. Ask the nation. One act of courage made this moment possible. So if you've got a voice, if you've got a heart, if you've got even an ounce of conviction, use it. Speak up, film it, share it, question it, hold it accountable. The room exploded into questions after he stepped away, but he didn't stay. He wasn't interested in the spin. He wasn't chasing headlines. Outside, the crowd was even bigger. Protesters, supporters, curious bystanders, and at the edge of it all, Sarah stood with her father, overwhelmed but steady. Kennedy walked straight to her, took her hand, and said, "You didn't just change my life. You changed the conversation." Her eyes welled, but she didn't cry. I couldn't not do something," she whispered. He nodded. That's exactly what bravery is. Behind them, the Capitol loomed large. But for once, it wasn't the center of the story. The power wasn't in the marble columns or the cameras. It was in the hands of a teenager with a phone, a senator with a voice, and a nation with a choice. The kind of choice that asks, will we let this be another viral moment that fades, or the beginning of something that doesn't? And if you've come this far into the story, then maybe it's your turn too. If you believe respect shouldn't be conditional, if you think real power is accountability, not control, then speak up. Share the story. And if you agree that silence is no longer an option, drop a comment below and write the number 9. Let them know we're not going back to pretending. Not now. Not ever. The days that followed were a blur of movement, meetings, interviews, policy sessions, but under all the headlines and applause, Senator Kennedy stayed focused on what mattered most: the people who didn't have the microphone. He returned to his office to find thousands of letters, voicemails, and emails from across the country. Not just words of support, but confessions, raw, emotional accounts from everyday travelers, veterans, single mothers, students, and elderly passengers who had been humiliated at checkpoints, accused without cause, or treated like criminals for no reason but a hunch and a uniform. Kennedy read every single one. His aides begged him to delegate, to let staff filter them, but he refused. If they trusted me with their stories, he said, then the least I can do is listen. And that listening changed him. It cracked something deeper than pride. It awakened a responsibility that went beyond bills and voting records. He organized a public forum, not in D.C., but in Atlanta, right back at the airport where it all began. A large hangar was cleared, folding chairs arranged, and no press allowed inside unless they agreed to just listen. No flash, no spectacle. Just people, just truth. One by one, passengers stood to speak. A woman in her 60s shared how she was strip-searched for carrying a bottle of insulin. A teenage boy recalled being pulled into a room and interrogated because his last name sounded foreign. An Air Force veteran wept as he described the day he was denied boarding because he walked with a cane and was too slow. And then, to everyone's surprise, a former TSA officer asked to speak. He stood in silence for a beat before admitting, "I've been Rick. Maybe not to that extreme, but I've raised my voice when I shouldn't have. I've judged too quickly. And now I realize how easy it is to become the very thing we swore to protect people from." The room didn't erupt in judgment. No one shouted him down. Instead, something even more powerful happened. People listened. That kind of honesty wasn't weakness. It was the beginning of change. When Kennedy stepped up to close the forum, he didn't bring notes. He just stood before the crowd and said, "What happened to me was caught on camera, but what happened to you was caught in silence, and that silence ends now." He went on to announce that the Airport Conduct and Oversight Act had gained bipartisan support. It would move forward to the floor with overwhelming public pressure backing it, but he also warned them, gently but firmly, that legislation isn't a miracle. It's a mirror. "Laws don't fix culture," he said. "People do." The next day, TSA announced a sweeping change in policy: body cam-style recording devices for checkpoint officers, mandatory de-escalation training, and a new whistleblower protection program for airport staff. But it wasn't because a senator demanded it. It was because the country did. Because people, for once, wouldn't let the moment pass. Back in D.C., Kennedy returned to his office late one evening to find Sarah waiting. She wore a T-shirt that read, "Respect is mandatory," and held a small framed photo, one she had taken the moment Director Barrett stepped in at the checkpoint. It showed Rick mid-sentence, eyes wide, caught in the act. "I thought you might want this," she said. "A reminder." He took the photo gently, nodded, then looked her in the eye. "You know, I used to think power was something granted by position," he said. "But after that day, I realized something else. Real power is the moment you decide to do the right thing, even if nobody's watching, especially if nobody's watching." Sarah smiled. "Then I guess it's up to the rest of us to make sure somebody always is." He looked down at the photo, then out his window, where the Capitol dome glowed in the night like a lighthouse. Distant, steady, but only as strong as the people who believe in it. And for anyone still listening to this story, here's the truth. The system may be flawed, but it isn't unbreakable. Silence lets injustice grow. But courage? Courage stops it cold. So the next time you see something wrong, don't ask who the victim is. Ask what you're willing to do about it, because the world doesn't change with outrage. It changes when someone like you decides it's no longer acceptable to look away. Now, if that's you, if you believe in dignity for all, not just the powerful, then hit share. Drop a 9 in the comments. Be counted. Because this story isn't finished. And maybe you're the one who writes the next chapter.